I'm going to continue my discussion of the context of the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt. And I'd like to go back to one of the major issues that, in effect, created conditions that were friendly toward the election of a new president. Remember, at that time, Herbert Hoover was president, and he was a first-term president. He was the incumbent. Generally speaking, in elections, advantage goes to the incumbent candidate. And despite the fact that the Great Depression had started already during Hoover's tenure in office, you have to recall that the Depression was not viewed as the Great Depression. There had been boom and busts all through the history of the Industrial Revolution, and this kind of cycle was considered inevitable and commonplace to most Americans. However, the bonus march really basically damaged the presidency of Hoover. And I'd like to describe the events that were sort of most significant at that time. I'm going to read from a book, a biography of FDR by Gene Edward Smith, who incidentally was an academic, a professor at the University of Toronto for quite some time. In any case, Smith writes, now recall that this is before Roosevelt was elected. Events broke for Roosevelt. Throughout the late spring and early summer of 1932, unemployed veterans from World War I flocked to Washington to petition Congress for early payment of wartime bonuses that were due in 1945. They set up a shanty town on the banks of the Anacostia River in southeast Washington, and when space there ran out, occupied several vacant government buildings on Pennsylvania Avenue. At its height, the Bonus Army, as it was called, numbered more than 20,000. When the Senate rejected their petition, most went home, but many others, homeless and jobless, remained in the capital. Washington officials coped as best they could. Police Chief Pelham Glassford did his utmost to provide tents and bedding for the veterans, furnished medicine, and assisted with food and sanitation. Maintaining order was never a problem. The men were camped illegally, but Glassford, who had been the youngest brigadier general with the AEF in France, chose to treat them simply as old soldiers who had fallen on hard times. He resisted efforts to use force to dislodge them. Hoover did not share Glassford's equanimity. The specter of Bolsheviks storming the Winter Palace soon dominated administration thinking. The president refused to meet with the leaders of the Bonus Army, ordered the gates to the White House chained shut, and reinforced the guard to contain any demonstration. Secretary of War Patrick J. Hurley, convinced that the nation faced a communist uprising of vast proportions, lamented that the veterans had been so orderly and longed for an incident that might justify the imposition of martial law. On July 28th, under prodding from the White House, the District of Columbia commissioners ordered Glassford to clear the abandoned buildings along Pennsylvania Avenue in which the veterans were squatting. Brief resistance followed, shots rang out, 2 veterans were killed, and Hurley had his incident. The commissioners asked the White House for federal troops to maintain order. Hoover passed the request to Hurley, who ordered Army Chief of Staff General Douglas MacArthur to take appropriate action. That was at 2:55 p.m. Within the hour, troopers from the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, led by their 47-year-old executive officer Major George S. Patton, clattered across Memorial Bridge into Washington. They were joined by elements of the 16th Infantry from Fort Washington, supported by tanks and machine guns. MacArthur, who normally wore mufti into the War Department, changed into Class A uniform, replete with Sam Browne belt, medals, and decorations, and took command. At his side was his aide-de-camp and military secretary, Major Dwight D. Eisenhower, also in Class A. And Smith adds in a footnote, in fairness to Ike, he urged MacArthur to remain at the War Department and leave the operation to the troop commanders, but it was overruled. Quote, MacArthur has decided to go into active command in the fields, unquote, the chief of staff replied, speaking as he often did in the third person. Quote, there is incipient revolution in the air, end quote. By 5 o'clock, Army units had surrounded the buildings in downtown Washington occupied by the veterans. Cavalrymen drew sabers and cleared the streets while infantry with fixed bayonets emptied the buildings. The air was saturated with tear gas. Prodded by horses and tanks, the veterans fell back to their encampment on the Anacostia Flats. As evening fell, the Army troops paused to allow women and children to be evacuated. At 10:14 p.m., MacArthur gave the order to advance. After a tear gas barrage, the cavalry swept the camp, followed by infantrymen who systematically set fire to the veterans' tents and shanties lest anyone return. Coughing, choking, and vomiting, the veterans and their families fled up Good Hope Road into Maryland in safety. Quote, had President Hoover not acted when he did, said MacArthur at a War Department news conference afterward, he would have been faced with a very serious situation, end quote. The quote-unquote mob, as MacArthur saw it, was animated by, quote, the essence of revolution, end quote. The nation's press bannered the eviction across its front pages. A few, citing Cleveland's suppression of the Pullman strike in 1895, praised Hoover for acting decisively. Most lambasted the administration for excessive force. Quote, what a pitiful spectacle, end quote, said the normally Republican Washington Daily News. Quote, the mightiest government in the world chasing unarmed men, women, and children with army tanks. If the army must be called out to make war on unarmed citizens, this is no longer America, end quote. The New York Times devoted its first 3 pages to the coverage, including a full page of photographs. In the months ahead, the torching of the veterans' camp on the Anacostia Flats came to symbolize the insensitivity of the Hoover administration to the plight of the unemployed. Rexford Tugwell, who was in Albany on a speech-writing chore, recalls entering FDR's bedroom at breakfast and finding the morning newspapers spread all around. Pointing to the pictures in the Times, Roosevelt said they were, quote, scenes from a nightmare, end quote. He pointed to soldiers hauling resistors, still weeping from tear gas, through the wreckage to police wagons while women and children, incredibly disheveled and weary, waited for some sort of rescue. Roosevelt told Tugwell he regretted having recommended Hoover for president in 1920. Quote, there is nothing inside the man but jelly. Maybe there never has been anything, end quote. FDR said he might feel sorry for Hoover if he didn't feel sorrier for the people who had been burned out, 11,000 of them, according to the Times. Quote, they must be camping right now alongside the roads out of Washington, and some of them have families. It is a wonder there isn't more resentment, more radicalism when people are treated that way, end quote. Roosevelt continues, what Hoover should have done, quote, was to meet with the leaders of the Bonus Army when they asked for an interview. When 200 or so marched up to the White House, Hoover should have sent coffee and sandwiches and asked the delegation in. Instead, he let Pat Hurley and Doug MacArthur do their thing, end quote. MacArthur, FDR continues, has just prevented Hoover's re-election.